Chapter 21. Dance Macabre. One of Anton LaVey's friends, famed Hollywood historian Richard Lamparski, once commented that Anton seemed destined for a life of extremes. Moderation was not a watchword in his vocabulary. This was especially true during LaVey's final years. As the scope and international reach of his influence grew more potent, his longtime partner, Diane Hegarty, initiated court proceedings against him that would eventually force the sale of his beloved Black House. The year this biography was released, LaVey's youngest daughter, Zena, the same blonde toddler who sat so proudly upon the devil's altar for the first public satanic baptism, disowned her father, eventually publishing vile accusations of abuse. Even as LaVey was publishing more, recording more, and granting some of the best interviews of his career, his health deteriorated. In 1995, he had a sudden death experience and was resurrected. Unlike many men who have beaten unique paths through the underbrush of propriety and complacency, LaVey lived long enough to see glimmerings of his influence on films, fashion, magic, and music. He even welcomed a woman into his life and started a new family. The day his son was born, he said, was the happiest day of his life. But, as I wrote earlier, it seems something is always demanded in return for such happiness, in order to satisfy the natural balance. Anton LaVey's last years may have been his most fulfilling, but they were also the most painful. I ended this biography in 1990, 24 years ago. While LaVey was energized by the burgeoning interest in Satanism, much of it a backlash to the ridiculous accusations of human sacrifices and baby breeders spouted on daytime talk shows and nighttime investigator reports, he was resigned to personal isolation and loneliness. Diane, the woman he loved for 24 years, who had been with him throughout the founding and early development of the Church of Satan, had left him in 1984 on Walpurgisnacht. She was already lodging accusations of abuse in court against him, trying to force property divisions, even though they were never married. His daughters were distant. LaVey felt betrayed and bereft. By the time we concluded our work on this book, Anton LaVey and I realized there would be much more to our relationship. He began to trust again. Our passions, habits, and directions seemed to merge perfectly over time, and he began to share more of his secrets. He had already granted me access to his life in order to write this book. Now, he began to open his heart. Anton warned me early on that if I chose to be with him, it wouldn't always be paradise, and I'd be signing on for the duration. He didn't want more heartache if I decided things became too demanding or distasteful or frightening. But I've never been a dilettante. When I commit, I jump in with both feet, whooping and wriggling. I had admired Anton LaVey since I first read his biography when I was 12 years old. Now, having intimately examined his life and becoming increasingly indispensable, the world's most notorious black magician was inviting me into his realm, to be my mentor, my lover, taking me to the edges of sanity and physical endurance. The possibilities and challenges promised were irresistible. I signed over my soul and blood, knowing that my infernal pact had already been sealed years before. I moved into the Black House in January 1989. The Secret Life of a Satanist was well received and well timed. I gave several television and radio interviews, adding to the growing cynicism about recovered memories of terrifying satanic ritual abuse, and a whole host of atrocities purported by counselors. Irresponsible therapists were encouraging obscene fantasies, getting rich off deluded lunatics' health insurance during that period of mass hysteria, roughly between 1984 and 1995, that has since been termed the Satanic Panic. It was finally the insurance companies who stepped in and did some of the most thorough investigations and debunking. When insurance companies refused to pay any more of the multi-million-dollar claims for intensive therapy and hospitalization for satanic ritual survivors, the accusations dried up. The FBI in 1992 also spent hundreds of man-hours investigating claims of criminal activity supposedly linked to various satanic groups. They found nothing and published a comprehensive, vehement denial of all accusations. The true believers dismissed the FBI Lanning report, insisting that most high-level law enforcement agencies were already infiltrated by satanic forces. Slowly, the perpetrators of these ridiculous claims slunk off the national stage, many evaporating into obscurity, a few turning up later with similar but equally horrendous survivor stories. At least one posed as a Holocaust survivor, Barnyard Babe, Lauren Stratford. Anton LaVey's policy during the height of the satanic hysteria was to encourage what few glimmers of rationality he found by granting select interviews and tapping competent Church of Satan representatives to elbow their way into various talk shows to try to challenge the high-waist excrement being shoveled. Though he was offered a significant amount of money to appear on some of these geek shows, LaVey felt it would lend far too much legitimacy to their claims to have the high priest of Satan appear on television to match wits with delusional psychotics. He maintained a position of cynical bemusement over the entire affair, and knew that it would eventually die of its own absurdity. There were soon a handful of books published by psychologists explaining away the hysteria. While not defending Satanism per se, they were profoundly angry that the media seemed hell-bent on encouraging these destructive fantasies. Some of these authors appeared on talk shows to explain the ego needs of certain types of people who want to be known as survivors. At that time, many accusations were being used to tear families apart. Child Protective Services would be called in for allegations of satanic abuse, antagonistic parents used in such stories in divorce cases, and far too many innocent people were being thrown in jail in the turbulence of this modern-day witch hunt. When it was finally revealed that much of the madness originated from a handful of Christian evangelical police officers who were making money, giving instructive seminars to other officers, that the police were as complicit in concocting these fictional violent Satanists as were the false counselors and talk show hosts, the whole satanic panic came to a fairly abrupt, embarrassing end. Instead of wasting his creative energy defending himself to a brain-dead TV audience, LaVey concentrated on getting his books and music out to a more eclectic market, one greedy for satanic wisdom. LaVey's strategy was to show people the positive, indulgent, sardonic aspects of Satanism, rather than to entertain the befuddled masses with high-pitched protestations of innocence. He continued to inflame the unimaginative with his essays, narrated death scenes, a fascinating forensic film by Nick Bougas, and completed another video containing exclusive footage of LaVey speaking his mind, playing music, and cracking wise. These were all enthusiastically received by a growing underground attracted to a darker aesthetic and returned to evocative music. All manner of freaks and free thinkers found their way to the Black House, crediting Anton LaVey for creating an umbrella organization for their decadence and outrage. Artists, politicians, performers, musicians, eccentric businessmen all drew courage and inspiration from this modern-day C.A. Rotwang behind our foreboding, barbed-topped fence. Yet, Anton seldom revealed his personal challenges to those who drew strength from him. He understood what it was to be an icon, and didn't want his problems to obscure his accomplishments when his history was written. LaVey faced various attacks during his last years, health issues and petty, vengeful souls, but felt it was below him to focus attention on those tedious aspects of his existence. In 1990, the onslaughts were hitting him on 3 fronts at once, even as the original printing of this biography was going to press. Ex-partner Diane Hegarty initiated the main complications. She had requested restraining orders against Anton since 1985 and continued to hound him in various court proceedings. She was making demands for video dispositions and inventories of personal property, fodder for those eager to nose into his private affairs. LaVey began to drag his feet on her legal requests, hoping Diane and her series of contingency lawyers will become discouraged enough to leave him alone. We received letters almost weekly, demanding outlandish payments and property Diane didn't deserve. Brash and brilliant filmmaker Kenneth Anger, longtime magical comrade of LaVey's who lived in the Black House for a time in the early 1990s, impatiently urged Diane to stop burning your bra and just come home. Carla, Anton's older daughter, who had been living in Amsterdam for several years, moved back to the States about 1985, partly because of some tempting business opportunities, but largely because her father needed her emotional support. Though she didn't move back into the Black House until a year before he died, she stayed nearby, and we went to Carla's apartment for dinner every week or 2. Her dad appreciated her encouragement and perspective. Zena, on the other hand, seemed to grow ever distant. Though she had been supportive of her father, even credited with writing the introduction to a new release of The Satanic Witch, she was increasingly torn by the conflict between her mother and father. Anton told me in 1989 that he'd never felt closer to his youngest daughter. Though she had lived in the Black House earlier with her young son, Stanton, she was then living in Los Angeles, pursuing an acting career. For the first time, Zena seemed interested in the Church of Satan and genuinely prideful about her dad's accomplishments. They spent long hours talking on the phone about her aspirations, boyfriends, raising Stanton. LaVey took pride in his daughter, introducing her to various influential contacts in Hollywood. But the more her father did for her, the more resentful Zena seemed to become. She made a few television appearances, representing Satanism well, but she grew huffy about doing publicity for her father. It was inconvenient and below her station. She started a short-lived mail-order enterprise called The Black House, marketing satanic books and items of interest. Though Anton encouraged her, granting her exclusive distribution rights to some of his early writings and recordings, even including flyers for her business in our general information packets, Zena felt her father was too critical of her. Bolstered by a bitter mother and her new boyfriend, Zena began to concoct a mythology for herself in which her own importance far surpassed her father's. She went to dinner with him one evening and suggested, for her father's safety, that Anton retire to the Swiss Alps or somewhere equally blissful, and allow her to take over the Church of Satan for him. The satanic frenzy was still hot. LaVey was getting old, and Zena felt that newer administration for the church was neglecting many of the founding members of the organization. Anton declined her offer. Within a few months of this conversation, Zena claimed she ritually severed herself from her father, writing a letter to a known LaVey detractor, disowning her surname, establishing her contempt for her unfather. By the end of 1989, she had turned her back on LaVey, never to speak to him again. The betrayals of his loved ones began to take a physical toll on LaVey. Because of Diane's ever-present legal harassment, Anton had to sell off many of his prized collectibles, items he had treasured since childhood. The constant worry and strain began to further weaken his heart, already damaged by the fever he had contracted in Europe as a teenager. LaVey had known from his early 50s that unless he agreed to have the valves replaced, the condition would only get worse. He knew his body best and felt artificial valves might be rejected or become infected, causing complications. Anton made the fateful decision not to have the valves replaced. In 1990, he began to feel the effects of that decision. He was hospitalized twice in that year. After some time, his cardiologist was finally able to find a drug combination that would ease the swelling of his heart and keep his rhythm fairly stable. Though Anton's health was compromised, his vigor continued unchecked. He was making exciting contacts on various fronts, sharing time and granting interviews to those who highlighted his blasphemy, his encyclopedic knowledge, and his devilish humor. Despite, or because of, the satanic hysteria still raging through Bible-thumping Middle America, the high priest was garnering increasing support from heretics in the U.S. and around the world. LaVey's first essay collection, The Devil's Notebook, was published in 1992 by Adam Parfrey's Feral House. Adam and Anton met through mutual friends and hit it off immediately, speaking in code of obscure references to odd crimes, social movements, and outrageous characters as if they'd been friends for centuries. I've met no one else who can match Anton's wide-ranging knowledge of the darkest corners of human existence as Adam Parfrey could. When Parfrey heard that Anton had a manuscript he'd put together years ago, just waiting to find the right person to bring it to reality, Adam enthusiastically agreed to publish The Devil's Notebook. It contained such treasures as the importance of keeping a secret, music for the ritual chamber, and clothes make the slave. In his introduction to the book, LaVey described his philosophy. My brand of Satanism is the ultimate conscious alternative to herd mentality and institutionalized thought. It is a studied and contrived set of principles and exercises designed to liberate individuals from a contagion of mindlessness that destroys innovation. I have termed my thought Satanism because it is most stimulating under that name. Self-discipline and motivation are affected more easily under stimulating conditions. Satanism means the opposition, and epitomizes all symbols of nonconformity. Satanism calls forth the strong ability to turn a liability into an advantage, so turn alienation into exclusivity. In other words, the reason it's called Satanism is because it's fun, it's accurate, and it's productive. Around this time, the singer/popular historian/filmmaker Nick Bougas directed a delightfully evocative video about LaVey entitled Speak of the Devil. Like Satanist before, the film captures LaVey's eclectic range. He is seen joking about the Johnson Smith catalog of novelties, playing circus anthems and lusty burlesque music at the keyboards, expounding on the grand spectrum of human perversities and evoking the dark gods. There is extensive footage of LaVey in the Black House, including shots of the notorious front ritual chamber, where the satanic wedding and baptisms took place, as well as footage of the Den of Iniquity, where Anton displayed many of his artificial human companions, lounging lasciviously next to the Hammond organ or passed out at the bar next to the Rockola jukebox. Through Nick Bougas, we made another valued contact around this time. He introduced us to the dashing team of artist Coop and his impressive partner, later wife, Ruth Waits. Coop had developed a bold style, expressing his jaded humor and cultural obsessions using jarring colors and defiantly naughty images. As soon as we met, we saw that both Coop and Ruth fully appreciated the carny audaciousness blended with dark romanticism that is the essence of Satanism. LaVey and Coop shared a boyish enthusiasm for plump, over-sexed women, as well as for cars and guns. Ruth, like Jane Mansfield before her, delighted in waggling her considerable assets in the faces of flustered gentlemen, all the while possessing a keen intelligence and subtle heart. Since Coop was already well known for his stylish devil girls, he created a garish, bally-type poster for the Church of Satan in 1996, combining sensuality with the devil's flair for showmanship. Since Anton LaVey's death, Ruth has remained a sincere friend, a source of strength, and no bullshit advice I depend on. Diabolical spirits continued to flock to LaVey. Another excellent interview/article originally published in 1992 and included in Splatterpunks 2 in 1995 appeared in Jim and Debbie Goad's insightful and ever-inciting Answer Me zine. Enlivened by the Goads' misanthropy and elitist sympathies, LaVey opened up, expounding on his satanic attitudes toward masochistic consumerism, his disdain for stupidity and shit disturbers, and the necessity for a sense of humor. I think a satanic figure that would be humorless would be intolerable, said LaVey. That old adage that I laugh that I might not cry, I think applies to Satan. Because concerning the sorrows of Satan, his dismay at seeing this fucked up kind of world would necessitate that he had to have a sense of humor, or some kind of outlet for his dismay, or for what would be devastating to him. Jim Goad concluded the article with a quote from LaVey regarding the nobility of animals. I wouldn't squash a spider, but I could kill a human being. A spider is being the best spider he could be. He's fulfilling his purpose as a spider. He meshes perfectly with nature's overall scheme. Nothing in nature is wasted, and I can't say the same about people. Another valued contact from this time was Boyd Rice. We first saw his name as the primary source in a book called Incredibly Strange Films, a research book published by Andrea Juno and V. Vale. Anton was delighted when he found the book. Being an avid collector of strange, oddball, overlooked, unappreciated films, underappreciated, he had said many times there should be a comprehensive source book for such movies. And that's exactly what Incredibly Strange Films is. Vale and Juno eventually approached LaVey with an idea for a project, perhaps an interview in an upcoming book they were developing on the modern primitive movement. piercings, body modification and ritualized scarring, bloodletting, etc. The team was putting on a film series in San Francisco and invited us to attend several events. At one such evening, perhaps the one showcasing Ted V. Michaels, we met the infamous Boyd Rice, industrial musician and prankster extraordinaire. Anton and Boyd hit it off famously from that first night. We developed a standing meeting on Wednesday nights after dinner and when Boyd was living in San Francisco. We'd watch rare old films, listen to Dr. LaVey play, and share ideas until dawn. After escorting him back down the dimly lit hallway to the front door and saying goodbye, I'd watched Boyd through the peephole in the front door, striding across the street toward Geary, swinging his Barnabas Collins cane through the pre-dawn mist. Through Boyd, we met Adam Parfrey and Nicholas Schreck of Radio Werewolf, who eventually married Zena many years later. Schreck was originally going out with a lovely woman named Fiona, living in downtown San Francisco in a well-appointed apartment with deep red velvets and cemetery rubbings, complete with an authentic satanic altar acquired from an early church member. It was Boyd who finally persuaded Anton to record some of his lengthy sessions at the keyboard. Being a musical pioneer himself, Boyd was chilled at the idea that LaVey's music was going unheard by those who could appreciate it most. America was on the verge of a musical rejuvenation. It was called lounge music, bachelor pad music, or cocktail music. But whatever it was called, kids were scouring the record bins at thrift stores for hits by Sinatra, Russ Columbo, Little Peggy March, Helen Morgan, Martin Denny, and other popular American artists from the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Rice felt it was important for others to appreciate LaVey's musical style and encyclopedic repertoire. We met Greg Turkington of Amarillo Records, who was also enthusiastic about getting Dr. LaVey's music out to a wider audience. And by the end of 1993, a couple of Anton's recordings were finally available. But that was just one change among many during that pivotal year in Anton's life. The legal battle with Diane stumbled forward. On August 5, 1991, Miss Hegarty had been granted a comically inflated judgment totaling in excess of nearly $1 million. The Black House and all the treasured artifacts therein were ordered to be sold within 60 days, with all the proceeds going to Miss Hegarty and her lawyers. The fact that the judge who signed the order was a notorious Catholic feminist was presumed irrelevant. LaVey had no choice but to retreat to bankruptcy court. By the beginning of 1993, one of Anton's longtime comrades, San Francisco hotelier and multimillionaire Donald Werby, was willing to buy the Black House and allow the Black Pope to live there. Although Diane was disappointed with the arrangement, she made it clear to friends she wanted Anton out on the sidewalk. She was pleased with the $240,000 she received. Their agreement allowed Anton to abort the bankruptcy proceedings. Though he would now have to pay rent, and was understandably bitter, with the resolution of legal entanglements with Diane, our situation seemed more secure than it had been in all the time we lived together. We decided it was time to have a child. I knew I'd be left to regret it all my life if we didn't have a child together. A month after I met Anton LaVey, he wrote me a heartfelt letter making his intentions clear. I was moving to San Francisco, and I would be included in his life. From our first moments together, we knew there was something unique and enduring between us. We joked that it was almost as if we had arranged to meet each other in this life, even though we missed a couple of decades in the age department. We never felt the difference. The night we met, May Day, 1984, he enchanted me with music I'd always heard in my head, but was never able to find on a recording. I was excited to meet him, to say the least. Having admired him for so many years, I expected to find a man in his declining years, maybe a little chubby, maybe a slightly highly pitched voice, perhaps a bit full of himself. Such little imperfections wouldn't have diminished my admiration for him. I mostly wanted to shake his hand, to thank him for formulating and advocating a philosophy that had helped keep me sane. Instead, I found Anton LaVey to be sincere, erudite, and thoroughly disarming. From that night, I realized Anton had a gift for creating a presence of mystery and portent around him, like a magnetic field, almost palpable. He hugged me hello, and I breathed deeply of his distinctive, intoxicating scent. Old wood, male musk, ancient books and leather. We kissed in the hellish sunset glow on the parapet overlooking the cliff house. From that moment, I knew I could never leave him. Anton embodied the confidence, intelligence, and dangerous intensity I found impossibly compelling. Over the ensuing years, I provided him with youthful enthusiasm and energy, encouraged his most blasphemous opinions and obsessions, and grew to be his buffer between our citadel and the often ugly, depressing world beyond the gates of the Black House. We brought out the devil in each other. Like Barrymore and so many other poetic souls before him, LaVey was drawn into the sordid and seedy. He had an insatiable and playful sexuality, and lived out his sybaritic pleasures, which was only fitting for the high priest of earthly delights. Our personalities and minds meshed so well, we wanted to produce our own eugenic experiment. That decided, life went on for us. There was a lush fashion layout published in a San Francisco magazine called The Nose, which included vivid photos of Anton at his keyboards, holding an intimidating blade, and one with his prized 1936 cord. The photographer slipped me into that one. Though I have few pictures of the two of us together, I was usually the one taking the photos. This particular photo remains close to my heart. Even though there are 3 people pictured, a fetching blonde was included for heightened sensual appeal, our son was present, even then squirming mischievously inside me. On November 1st, 1993, the Day of the Dead in Latino cultures, Satan Xerxes Karnacki LaVey was born. His father was overwhelmed at the tiny bundle of life. Anton's doctor said later he was a changed man after Xerxes came along, that he added precious years to Anton's life. Xerxes gave him someone to delight, a reason to keep going. A woman involved in the Nose photo shoot hooked us up with Greg Turkington, who was enthusiastic about getting Anton's music into the hands of an eager audience. The year Xerxes was born, LaVey released Honolulu Baby and Answer Me on vinyl to see if there was a market. It quickly sold out. Plans were made for a longer album, and the 10-inch Strange Music album was released in 1994, as well as a re-release of the Satanic Mass, which was a recording of authentic Church of Satan rituals and recitations originally issued in 1968. Harking back to the flood of men's magazines which covered the female nude altars and lust ceremonies when the church first emerged, an intriguing article appeared in High Society in 1994, written by erotic showman Bob Johnson. There was also a lengthy article in the works for the eclectic magazine Ben is Dead. We were spending time acquainting ourselves with our son, eating at our favorite restaurants, sharing time with friends, and indulging in the occasional gun show at the Cow Palace. That was quite a sight. This overblown blonde swaying on 4-inch heels, pushing a baby stroller amongst the Lugers and Colts, thumbing through the Paladin press books on how to be your own undertaker, accompanied by the notorious High Priest of Satan. Not everyone recognized Anton LaVey, thankfully, but he always knew how to apply that compelling command to look, and those who did recognize him were usually admiring and discreet. On February 22nd, 1995, we were expecting to have a friend and local church official over for dinner. Just before we began to get ready for the evening, Xerxes took his first steps. He hadn't been in any hurry to walk, hadn't even seemed very intent on practicing along couches and tables as most babies do. But that day, all at once, he was up. His dad was having a hard time leaning over and keeping up with him. He wanted to speed around so quickly. We hurriedly shot some video of the grand moment, Xerxes beaming with pride at his accomplishment, and us beaming right back. By the time our friend showed up, Xerxes was exhausted, sleeping peacefully in his crib. We ordered Chinese food, and while we ate, we listened to the master tape of Anton's latest album, a full-length CD called Satan Takes a Holiday. As we sat at the dinner table and the cramped kitchen of the Black House, talking about the debilitating effects of MSG, Anton suddenly closed his eyes and slumped sideways. As soon as we realized Anton had passed out, our friend sprang to the phone to call 911, and I was trying to help Anton regain consciousness. Our guest had to juggle through a Marx Brothers array of phones. We had a non-operational phone from the 1920s sitting beside the real one on an antique operating table in the next room. He got the operator and told her our address. By this time, I was shaking Anton, screaming at him not to die, that his son needed him, and I needed him. He seemed to respond slightly, but it was as if he was in a deep sleep from which he couldn't rouse himself. The 911 operator told us to get him flat on the ground and begin CPR, which we did. I told our friend to lock the cats in the bathroom and quickly explained how to use the security buzzer on the front gate. He went to watch for the ambulance. As I rhythmically breathed and paused for the man who was my entire world, Anton seemed to take a big, shuddering breath, then another. I kept yelling to him how much I loved him, how much he couldn't leave us, as if speaking down a deep well, not knowing whether he could hear me or not. The paramedics were there in record time, about 5 minutes, and scooted me away to do their job. I went to the next room to take care of the now awakened Xerxes. Our dinner guest was forced back into the corner by the keyboards and the rush of emergency personnel and equipment. He had the best view of what life-saving techniques were going on. All I could see were large firemen's backs. I found out later that Anton was flatlined when the paramedics arrived. They shocked him 3 times before they got a response. One emergency worker was disturbed, he later told Anton's doctor, because even though LeVay was flatlined, he reached up and grabbed at the EMT's throat when he leaned over him. The medical team struggled to get Anton out of the house on a stretcher, maneuvering around the bulky antiques and Anton's remaining collection of oddities down the narrow red-lit hallway. They were taking him to the UCSF Medical Center. We let the cats out of the bathroom, gathered up the baby, and sped out behind them, only getting lost once along the way. They brought him directly to the cardiac ICU, and our friend kept Xerxes amused and distracted while I hovered in and out of the unit, talking to doctors and glimpsing Anton when they'd let me. Our guest left the hospital about 2 or 3 a.m. I stayed until 5 or 6, when the staff urged me to get some sleep. Anton was stabilized and would need me later. I went home to a quiet, lonely house. The paramedics left discarded needles, syringe wrappings, and flexible plastic hoses in their wake, along with the expensive black silk jacket and shirt they'd cut off Anton's body for speedy access. I cleaned up the kitchen, throwing away the Chinese food the cats hadn't eaten. Xerxes was exhausted and ready to sleep. I lay on the couch near him and tried to chase the spiraling fears from my mind. I called my parents to help me take care of Xerxes, anticipating I'd have to spend most of my hours at the hospital. They got the next flight out and arrived at UCSF Med Center later that morning, after I'd returned there. The doctors gave me an update. Anton had what they called a sudden death experience. As best they could tell, he had an episode of severe tachycardia, when the heart races too fast and inefficiently to pump blood to the brain. The brain had too little oxygen to function, and Anton passed out. The attending doctor calmly explained that it was likely that, because of oxygen deprivation, Anton would lose some of his memory, and possibly some of his functions, depending on how extensively the brain was damaged. They would have to wait until he was more alert to do an assessment. I nodded, numbly. I rolled Xerxes in his stroller back and forth along the endless hospital hallway, pacing blindly, trying to remember the last song I heard Anton play, the last joke he told, trying to embed them in my memory, in case I'd never hear him play or speak again. I sat with him for the next few days, listening to the whooshing and beeping of various monitors and regulators, the quiet laughter and conversations from the nurse's station, wondering what our life would be like now. Anton began to wake sporadically. He'd mutter, "Oh shit," and start pulling at the tube going into his nose. I'd hold his hand and gently tell him what had happened, where he was and why, tell him to rest. He'd looked confused for a bit, then drift back to sleep. Gradually, over the course of those first 2 days, he began to focus on who I was, and said he had no recollection of anything that had happened. I didn't quiz him to see how his memory was, but he seemed to be coming around, and the doctors were pleased that he had apparently, magically, lost no function of limbs or body. The next day I brought Xerxes to see him. "Hi, pal," Anton said, recognizing him immediately. "Why don't you take him down to the casino to see the slot machines?" His perception still somewhat hazy, but improved. That night, when I sneaked home to get some sleep, I got a frantic call from the night nurse telling me I'd better come back to the ICU right away. I'd rushed back to find Anton sitting on a chair by the window in his room, nearly naked. He ripped off the IV and oxygen and was determined to go home. He'd been running up and down the halls looking for where they'd hidden his clothes. It had taken 3 security guards to get him back in his room. "He's remarkably strong. Are you sure the age you listed is correct?" the nurse asked as we peeked into his room. "His hands and forearms are so muscular." "He's played the keyboards for 3 or 4 hours every day for most of his life," I replied absently, easing into his room. "Hi." I slid past the bed, glancing at a discarded straitjacket lying there. "What's going on?" "These people won't let me leave. I want to get my clothes and get out of here," he said with conviction. "I checked myself into this place, and I can leave whenever I want to. I have your clothes at home." I rubbed his back. "You can't leave yet. You've been very sick, and they have to make sure you're okay. Do you remember what happened?" "I remember exactly what happened," he said. "I remember I finally agreed to those tests they wanted me to take. I remember walking up the front steps and checking myself in. My clothes are right in the next room. I just want to get out of here. You've got to go get my clothes." "Honey, you've got to trust me. That's not what happened. You've been very sick. You need to get better." Eventually, a particularly caring nurse and I were able to help him calm down enough to get back into bed. She gave him a gentle massage and asked him about his children. They had to sedate and restrain him for the rest of the night, and said he was very resistant to the drugs. They weaned him off the heavy sedation as he gradually progressed through the necessary levels of healing over the next few days. At times, he thought we were in Las Vegas, and I was auditioning for a singing job, or aboard ship. He complimented the nurse on the excellent shipboard food. It wasn't until many years later, when I went through my mother's death from cancer, that I understood Anton was probably reacting to the opiates they had him on. When she was in the hospital for surgery, my mother had visions she'd been in a terrible car accident and was paralyzed, and that one of the nurses had threatened to kill her. Someone finally told us that some people react to certain opiates with paranoid delusions. But no one bothered to tell me what Anton was going through at the time. We just assumed it had to do with his traumatized state. Eventually, there came a time when he was no longer hallucinating, and we marveled at what he'd been through. Well, we went to a follow-up visit with Anton's doctor after he was released from the hospital. Anton's main complaint was a pain in his chest. He asked the doctor if it was normal for people who've gone through what he went through. His doctor replied, "I don't know. Less than 7% of the people who have a SDE at home survive to ask that question." The cardiologist said I saved his life with CPR, but I credited his extreme force of will for keeping him alive. Anton never remembered that anything that had happened that day leading up to the attack. He also said he hadn't seen any tunnels or white lights or angels. We joked that now that he'd died and been resurrected, he could start his own religion. He never wrote much about his sudden death or mentioned it to many people. When he did write about it, he only said his death was the most unmemorable experience of his life. Both of us responded to his near death in different ways. I immediately wanted to have another baby. I don't know why. I don't quite know why. Life in the face of death. To give him more to hang on to. To give Xerxes a brother or sister while we could. Probably all of the above and more. Anton didn't agree, but promised me if he were still around in the year 2000, he'd make sure we'd have another child. One of the first things Anton did after being released from the hospital was to write a will. He was rather superstitious about wills and provisions for death, but he'd had a close call and realized that, since we weren't married, he wanted to make sure Xerxes was provided for. He assumed a handwritten will declaring his intentions clearly would be all I'd need. It's dated March 9th, 1995, and simply reads, "This is to state that upon my bodily death, all writings, artwork, property and/or holdings shall be controlled by Blanche Densley Barton as executor of my estate. Whatever dispersals she chooses to make regarding the above shall be with authority granted by myself to do so. Further, any moneys or other profits made by my earthly endeavors or holdings are to be held for my son Xerxes until he is capable of handling his own affairs, unless Blanche Barton deems otherwise. Anton Xander LaVey." He had mentioned to me that, specifically, he wanted Carla to have his 1936 Cord and his Whitney Wolverine, a rare gun. Beyond that, he trusted me to divide things as the situation dictated at the time of his inevitable demise. Xena had already disowned him years earlier, but he always held out hope they'd reconcile one day. Carla had also chosen to be out of our lives at that time and hadn't responded to her father's overtures and requests to see her. But he knew that I would act according to his wishes if things changed between them. Carla had her own life and was never directly involved in the running of the organization during the time I was with Anton. So she spent long months at a time not calling or contacting us, even though she still lived in the area. Anton also gave me a proclamation on June 21st, 1995, appointing me officially as the High Priestess of the Church of Satan, even though I had been acting in that capacity and acknowledged as such for many years. According to the bylaws of the corporation, however, I needed a document declaring me the high priestess so that I could take over the organization legally if LaVey should become incapacitated. We had every confidence that, with those two pieces of paper, Xerxes and I would be duly protected and provided for when the inevitable came. Having already experienced the San Francisco justice system, we should have known better. Satan Takes a Holiday, Anton LaVey's quirky and intimate full-length CD of some great American songs, was released later in 1995, garnering impressive reviews and airtime from a wide variety of counterculture quarters. Interviews, including the Ben is Dead article, continued to be published about the high priest and the church, and few of our cohorts even knew what Anton had been through. We also found it was time for some restructuring of the organization. In 1975, LaVey had disbanded the grotto system, which is what he called groups of Satanists ritualizing and working together on a local level. Administering the grottos had become too cumbersome and seemed to be an increasing forum for friction instead of the supportive, exciting local groups they should be. And increasingly, though, there were members who wanted to gather together for local meetings and study groups. We got letters weekly from groups like the Church of Dark Souls, Brethren of Darkness, Temple of Baphomet, Angel of Light Assembly, and others asking if and how they should start a grotto. Usually, if Anton trusted the person to do an adequate job, he'd agree to let them, but usually cautioned, "You'll be sorry." The groups seldom got off the ground, or if they did, members would begin draping themselves with embarrassing titles, jockeying for position with the group, and the whole thing would blow up in the misguided leader's face within a few short months. When I published The Church of Satan, I included a chapter of guidelines for grottos and groups, explaining a bit how to form your group and what to expect, but members longed for something more formalized. There was a revolution on the horizon. As the internet grew, more and more Church of Satan members were contacting each other online, getting together locally, forming their own grottos and seeking church recognition. Since we didn't provide a forum for group activities, they were doing it anyway, sometimes badly. Anton acknowledged it was fine for dedicated members to have this opportunity. But if they expected recognition from us, we would have to provide them with guidelines based on the administration's long years of experience. That way, we could have some degree of protection in case loonies gathered in the woods, sacrificed cats, and performed illegal acts in the name of Satan. We would also be able to encourage our best members to apply their potent energies toward common goals and to experience well-orchestrated rituals with like-minded individuals if they wished. So, with this in mind, in 1995, LaVey decided to revive the grotto system, along with the Church of Satan newsletter, The Cloven Hoof. These key outlets would provide guidance, inspiration, and information to those hungry for satanic theory and practice, and attention to those worthy of recognition. We spoke at length about the best methods for handling our growing international membership, for organizing grottos, and I codified what Anton decided in an internal book called The Church of Satan, Grotto Master's Handbook. Our first issue of the revived Cloven Hoof, which had been suspended for 7 years, contained articles, artistically altered ads, reviews, and limericks. The opening editorial declared, "Our focus will be a blend of sex and sarcasm, literacy and libido, to outrage and inflame." The sweeping changes were enthusiastically received by the ruling Council of Nine, as well as by dedicated members longing for contact with other Satanists. There was a sense of rejuvenation and refocusing for LaVey on many levels. His indomitable spirit prevailed, sending ripples of renewal and rebirth throughout the web of iconoclasts he'd nurtured most of his life. Carla LaVey's life took an interesting turn as well. Though she'd been living comfortably in the nearby town of Tiburon, across the bay, her situation changed, and she needed to move back into the Black House. Her father, of course, welcomed her presence back into his life. By Halloween of that year, Carla had moved in, and LaVey continued to write and record more than ever before. Though the spirit was willing, the flesh became increasingly weak. Anton had always enjoyed going out to dinner. We regularly visited the best restaurants from Santa Rosa to Half Moon Bay. But his heart condition caused his stamina to wane. We went out less and less. Fortunately, most of our favorite restaurants delivered. We met with friends in the Black House, and LaVey continued to grant selective interviews. His essays were steadily published in the Cloven Hoof and the Black Flame, an excellent satanic magazine that had been in publication for several years, edited by Peter Gilmore. Websites sympathetic to satanic thought emerged every day. Suddenly, there was more information readily available about true Satanism than ever before in history. Grottos sprouted across the country and around the world, with new grotto masters grateful for our guidance and membership referrals. Though the Church of Satan was growing steadily, the changes LaVey implemented were making it easier to weed out the unworthy quickly, allowing us to focus on our most promising members. Because Anton was in increasing pain, outings became rare over the next years. He didn't want to be seen dragging an oxygen tank around or be pushed in a wheelchair. We stayed home, we played with our beloved son, watched invigorating old movies, saw a select few individualists, and spent long hours talking and writing together. For the first time in his life, Anton began exploring fiction. Throughout the years, he'd had many friends who were fiction writers, but he never felt a pull toward that craft himself. Suddenly, the floodgates opened, and he found himself creating an entire small-town universe he called Plottsville. He peopled his world with 48 women, all named, described, and pictured. Photos he had painstakingly modified with Photoshop. Mostly between the ages of 33 and 55, usually married. Their husbands were merely included in their brief descriptions, almost as necessary window dressing, much like the men downstairs in the den of iniquity. Iris Zabisco, 39, married to Barris Zabisco, salesman at Mattress Mart. Harriet Billings, 41, married to Barney, owner of Barney's Beanery. Many of the town sketches he wrote were in form of newspaper articles, some published in the Cloven Hoof, but he also wrote little scenarios involving the decidedly sordid doings in Plottsville, which were evolving into chapters. Anton was compiling his material into a book he called Taking Out the Trash, Misadventures of Blanche Bierbauer, who sold her body for a tuna sandwich and a foot-long hot dog, by Adolfo Pipcho. In the introduction, LaVey wrote, This is a saga of life in America, as no literary diversion or historical account has portrayed it. Originally written in 1947, it shows a side of Americana that was hinted at in many forms, but chronicled in none. The stylistic approach is decidedly noir, yet there are elements of the idyllic lampooned to their highest power. Though the fetishistic is painfully obsessive, it is embarrassingly faithful. Many literary forms are amalgamated. Devices abound from the era. Elements of the Shutter pulps are combined with Blondie and Dagwood. Cornell Woolrich meets Nathaniel West, and both join James M. Cain. Only the stag party side of the lodge hall is seen. This is soiled underwear hanging on a Norman Rockwell clothesline, the horrors of war replaced by the ennui of peace. As the organizational workload increased, and both Xerxes and LaVey needed more of my help, Anton invited my father to move to San Francisco to live with us and help me with errands, informational mailings, and other tasks. We'd always had one or two trusted members working as office staff through the years, but the complication of Anton's health meant I could rarely be away from him for more than half an hour at a time. He'd met my dad on several occasions, and, though my father's never characterized himself as a Satanist, he's an atheistic fellow traveler. Dad had been helping me fulfill general information requests and maintain our mailing list long distance since 1990, when my writing and representation responsibilities grew after the publication of this biography. He and Anton had gotten along well, and they both saw I needed help. My father moved in with us in April 1997. The next month, Anton's health began to spiral downward. He was admitted to the hospital because of extreme anemia and was given transfusions. Though allowed to go home after just a few days, his doctors were concerned, not knowing what was causing apparent blood loss. Anton was hospitalized 5 times in the last 6 months of his life, including the night he died. On August 22nd, Carla and I were comforting each other in the waiting room of UCSF Medical Center when her father almost died on the operating table from a severely bleeding colon. After removing it, the surgeon said, though the colon wasn't cancerous, it was twisted and necrotized to such an extent it must have been causing him severe pain for years. I can attest to that. LaVey would sometimes writhe in bed for hours, clutching his .45, yelling and cursing. He said, though suicide can be an indulgence he strongly considered, he wouldn't want Xerxes and me to have to suffer through the aftermath of such violence. He'd seen it too many times as a crime scene photographer and would never want Xerxes to be haunted by those images of his own father. Even through the pain and complications of those last 6 months, Anton managed to give some fine interviews. He spoke at length to Boyd Rice for a second interview, published posthumously. Because of Rice's intimate knowledge of Anton and his deep understanding of Satanic philosophy, it is one of the best interviews LaVey ever gave. He also gave an interview to unrepentant agent provocateur Shane Bugbee and his wife Amy for their short-lived MF magazine. Another treasure Anton was able to contribute to was a gilded labor of love written on Dr. Cecil E. Nixon, ISIS and Beyond, by the anachronistic Doran Wittelsbach. Both Carla and Anton were able to reminisce about Nixon, a man who so profoundly influenced the high priest. LaVey was still practicing music when his stamina allowed, usually a little every day. We were making plans for a new CD. He was writing more than ever, most often an essay a day, slated for his new collection, Satan Speaks, due out in spring 1998. Stanton LaVey, Anton's grandson, contacted his grandfather soon after he turned 18. He was living with his grandmother, Diane, and wasn't allowed to contact Anton until he reached the age of majority. He was able to spend 1 or 2 precious evenings with his grandfather after being isolated from him since childhood. We continued with business as usual as much as we could, and indulged in cinematic distractions. We favored film noir, of course, and old dark house movies. LaVey had the definitive collection of videotape, acquired over many years. We also watched Key Largo, Johnny O'Clock, The Seawolf, The Black Cat, and Rio Rita, as well as a lot of Laurel and Hardy and Charlie Chan films. One night within 2 weeks of the night he died, we were watching a movie called A Double Life, with Ronald Colman as an actor whose perception of reality begins to blur. The ending is quite moving, and I began weeping uncontrollably. I'm not prone to sobs, but I really let loose rather unexpectedly. We cuddled on the couch. Anton could only hold me. I whispered to him, "I don't want you to go." He said nothing. Then came October 22nd. Anton had acquired a devil's doctor, a prominent San Francisco surgeon who admired LaVey and made it his business to watchdog the high priest's care, for which Anton was grateful. He came by that Wednesday to sample LaVey's blood and make sure the anemia hadn't returned. He said Anton didn't look well. He was weak, growing depressed, and was having minor blackouts. The surgeon called us later to say he'd gotten the lab results and that Anton would have to go back to the hospital. His blood count was dangerously low again. Neither of us were surprised. We keep coming back to this same bend in the river, don't we? Just like a recurring nightmare you can't wake from, Anton said. He checked into UCSF Med Center yet again, not long after dawn. They insisted he take an endoscopy. The doctors found a small bleeding point in his stomach, cauterized it, and let him go again Saturday. 3 days later, I came home from the post office with birthday gifts for Xerxes. Pants, books, and toys from friends in New York, Sweden, and elsewhere. We opened them with our boy, planning a real party this year. The night before, Anton had insisted on seeing the gift he'd asked Tony to get Xerxes from him, a shiny red fire truck. I thought it was kind of silly since I'd hidden it away, and Anton was going to see it on Xerxes' birthday in a few days anyway. But I brought it out for Dr. LaVey to see, complete with ladders and flashing lights. He was happy with it. He said every little boy should have a shiny red fire truck. LaVey said he was cold, and his throat hurt when he swallowed. Not surprising. It was autumn in San Francisco. Maybe he was coming down with the flu. We had a friend, Margie Bauer, coming that evening to help with office work. We had a quick bowl of soup, and I went to greet her and get some correspondence done myself. LaVey and Xerxes were watching some Laurel and Hardy shorts they loved to see together. Carla was in her private quarters upstairs, and my dad was downstairs working on mailings as well. As I popped in to check on them during the evening, Anton said he was experiencing pain when he breathed. Could it be we'd have to go back to the hospital again so soon? Maybe pneumonia? We decided to wait until after Marge left at 11 p.m., and if it was still bad, we'd head for the emergency room. Unfortunately, that decision was taken out of our hands. Anton began to walk unsteadily, then lost consciousness sometime just before 11 p.m. I called upstairs to Carla that her father had collapsed and needed her. She ran down and stayed at his side, trying to rouse him, while I called 911 and quickly ushered Marge out to the front gate. She could sense something was wrong, but was too discreet to ask. Before she and her boyfriend got around the corner, they spied the ambulance rushing to our front door. Xerxes also knew something was wrong, and knew the drill all too well. He put his coat on by himself and trotted dutifully downstairs to be with Grandpa. The EMTs didn't take Anton to UCSF this time. They said the cardiac unit at St. Mary's was closer and much better. His surgeon, who met us at the hospital, agreed. Carla and I paced yet again, trying to distract ourselves, reading signs in the lounge and in the still hallways, looking toward the room where the doctors worked, trying to save Anton's life. It didn't seem there was going to be much of a change, so Carla went home about 6 a.m. I tried to catch a nap on an undersized settee in the tiny waiting area. Shortly before 9 a.m. on October 29th, a doctor I'd only glimpsed from down the hallway took me into another little room and told me Anton LaVey was dead. I called Carla and told her to come back to the hospital, that her father was gone. She rushed back, and we spent a few minutes with Anton before they wheeled him away. We went home, numb and exhausted. We decided that, since it was so close to Halloween, that we would keep Anton's death quiet for a few days, so that those who cared about him wouldn't have their holiday tainted, this year at least, with the pain of losing him. It also allowed us time to grieve privately before we had to announce our loss to the world and confront the inevitable decisions, questions, and consequences. Anton had decided and communicated to us sometime before that he wanted to be cremated. He liked the idea of hanging around those he loved, if only in the form of ashes in an urn. He much preferred the post-death life at Jeremy Bentham, whose body was preserved intact for years and brought out to sit in on important meetings. But that's illegal in the States, as is burying loved ones in the backyard, which he would have considered appropriate, beside his beloved pets he'd buried there over the years. Anton didn't want to be buried in a local cemetery. It would be too much of a temptation for fan or foe to dig him up and go joyriding with his corpse or hide him away for decades like Eva Peron. Carla made arrangements for Anton's cremation, and we held a small ceremony right before his body was consumed by the flames. We played his recordings of the Hymn of the Satanic Empire and the funerary theme from the Satanic Mass CD. We invoked the dark gods, asked them to welcome and strengthen their brother in his transformation, and we read a poem by Robert E. Howard called The Men Who Walk with Satan. We waited outside among the tombstones, watching the black smoke drift wraith-like into the clear, sunlit sky.